Hello, welcome, and thank you for being part of WorkSafe's Recovery and Return to Work Following a Mental Injury at Work webinar. My name is Chris McKenzie from WorkSafe's media team. I'll be your host for today's session, and I'm being joined by three WorkSafe experts. Lucas Kowalski is a manager for Return to Work. Hi, Lucas.
Hey, Chris.
Chris Lyons is a recovery claims specialist. Good morning, Chris.
G'day, Chris.
And Joe Else is a clinical panel psychologist. Hi, Joe.
Good morning, Chris.
Thank you all for joining us today. So this morning, we're going to be examining the barriers to returning to work following a mental injury. It can often be more complex and take longer to achieve than after a physical injury, for example. And importantly, no two people will experience a mental injury in the same way. That's why, as we'll hear, it's vital to tailor recovery and return to work support to an injured worker's individual needs. So in this session, a member of WorkSafe's clinical panel will present clinically based recommendations that employers can consider when supporting an injured worker following a work-related mental injury, including the use of collaborative case conferences with the WorkSafe agent. And we'll explore the following key topics with our experts. The recovery and to return to work of an injured worker following their workplace injury is a collaborative effort, and parties do have a series of practical resources that can be accessed if additional support is required. Let's get the ball rolling. Lucas, I'm going to start with you. You're from the Return to Work team at WorkSafe and helped set up the Recovery and Return to Work program at WorkSafe Victoria. Could we start by asking for a high-level summary of the Recovery and Return to Work program and why it was introduced?
Okay, Chris. So we started back in March 2020, somewhat prompted by the COVID pandemic and the impact some of the lockdowns and shutdowns we're having on our injured workers who were at work as part of their return to work. But as you mentioned, no injury is the same. So that extends to all injury types, so physical injury and also mental injury. And we stood up the Recovery and Return to Work program as a collaborative, intervention using our data, the copious amounts of data we have about claims and injuries in Victoria, but also then setting up a conference type collaboration intervention with our agent panel. So we have 4 agents in Victoria, and we also have a panel of 22 WorkSafe approved occupational rehab providers. So the program was stood up, bringing together those stakeholders in combination with internal subject matter experts like our clinical panel. And we identify injured workers who are probably a bit more vulnerable insofar as their recovery return to work. And the purpose of the Recovery Return to Work program is to identify what additional supports that individual will require, what supports their employer may need, and then executing that support over a period of time.
And Lucas, you mentioned there that we're using claims data to drive this. Have you got some recent numbers you could show us that illustrate the current state of play, say in the last 12 months, and what they tell us about mental injuries and return to work?
Yeah, so the focus is very much in the mental injury space because we're receiving more claims from injured workers for mental injury than ever before. So last year, there were just over 32,000 claims lodged on WorkSafe across all injury types, all employer segments, of which 5,000 or 15% were for a mental injury. And so this is up from 13% in the 2021 financial year. So there's been some increased growth year on year of Victorians who are sustaining a mental injury at work. In the last year, so of the workers with a mental injury, 41% made a return to work 6 months after they were injured, and that compares to 53% 5 years ago. So more of our injured workers are struggling to return to work 6 months after they've been injured. And that's one of the other reasons why the Recovery Return to Work program was introduced to really bring forward some of those circumstances where that injured worker does require some additional tailored support that may have not already been considered. So one of the things that we do see behind the data, and when we look at claims at a desktop level and interactions of the employer and the injured worker, is that success really relies on collaborative communication. So not just between the injured worker and the employer, but also between the injured worker, the employer, and even the worker's GP or their treating health provider, their psychologist, because that's where information is shared about recovery and return to work. And the more information we share, I think the more sustainable and safe the return to work outcomes can be.
Thank you, Lucas, for that. It might be a good opportunity to take a look at some of the poll responses because we do have quite a lot of responses coming through. So keep putting your answers in the poll, but we'll run through them now. So the question again was for the employers and return to work coordinators in the audience, what experience do you have with collaboration when an employee has sustained a mental injury? At the moment, 40% is the top response of some experience, but could use some additional guidance. 30% are saying that they've never had to support someone with a mental injury. 20% are saying they have some experience, and only 10% are saying they have quite a lot of experience. Lucas, what are your thoughts on those responses so far?
Somewhat not surprising. I think we often do see with employers in particular where a mental injury claim has been submitted, they're not comfortable, not sure about what collaboration may look like. I don't think they're not keen on it, but I just think they're unsure of who they can talk to. So, for example, one of the things that employers can do is seek some approval from the injured worker to meet with the worker's psychologist or training provider to share some of that information. So, one of the reasons of Health and Safety Month is try to, I guess, promote some of the ways that collaboration can happen. So I really hope that some of the stakeholders out there can perhaps pick up some of the practical ideas we bring forward today.
Perfect. Thanks, Lucas. And as I mentioned, keep those responses coming through. We'll come back to the poll a little later in the webinar. Chris, I want to bring you in now. Lucas has just mentioned the power of collaboration in this space. Could I ask you how the Recovery and Return to Work program is delivered operationally and the benefits you see of genuine collaboration?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. The Recovery and Return to Work program is identifying multiple target groups across the claims that we have here at WorkSafe. Lucas touched on the data that we use. So those the groups that we have targeted for the Recovery Return to Work programs are based on the data and potentially poorer outcomes or an additional layer of support that are needed for these individual claims. So the process obviously is identifying the claim, providing the claim to those that are involved to review and prepare. Then we meet together. So the meeting itself, we call it case conference, and we talk through the claims. We all have the background on the claim, but those involved in the case conference might be someone like myself from WorkSafe, someone like Joe that'll speak soon from our clinical panel. We've also had physios and GPs as well as psychiatrists involved in these discussions to help support the strategic elements of supporting these injured workers' recovery and return to work. So the discussion's quite is led by our agents, usually a case manager at one of our agents. They'll provide the background on the claim, and then together we will strategise and we'll discuss the claim and try and identify the gaps that might be in this individuals, this injured workers' recovery and return to work program. So ideally, we're trying to maximise the support that we can provide the injured worker to ensure they recover and then return to work safely. Key parts of the program are obviously the record keeping of each individual's role and responsibility within the case conference and follow through of those actions. Often we come up with some target actions that we really need to establish and execute on, supported by our experts on the clinical panel. And it really is the follow through as well as that collaboration piece that makes these programs a huge success. And, I guess touching on, Lucas's earlier point as well, which you'll hear through our discussion today, but it is that collaboration piece that where we all do meet, we understand the claim, and we work together to try and support the injured worker as much as we can.
Thanks, Chris. Have you got a real life case study you could share with the audience that kind of illustrates that good collaboration in action?
So this is Jeremy's case study. Jeremy was obviously a client or an injured worker of the scheme, works in emergency services. So you'll see on the screen there, the bottom bar there is the timeline for Jeremy's claim from the point he was injured to the point he returned to work. So for Jeremy, the things that really stood out for me on this particular example and other examples that we have seen where we get good results, where injured workers workers that do recover quickly and do return to work. The first thing is the employer's early intervention program here. So before Jeremy actually even becomes injured, he has some difficulties at work, and he is supported, and there's a support network there for Jeremy before he even goes off work. Then he has another incident at work where he does lodge a work cover claim, and then he does go off work. So, it was very unfortunate for Jeremy. He was receiving some treatment and support at that time, but it was identified that he needed additional treatment and support. The incident form was acted upon by the employer. I think that's a key feature of what's happened here for Jeremy. We often see that an incident may happen in the workplace, and the employer either isn't quite sure of what to do next or what support might look like. But essentially for Jeremy, it was the employer reaching out and showing empathy and care around his situation, that he had been injured. He'd submitted obviously the incident form, and he was workers' compensation claim. The other key point, which I can't stress enough on for Jeremy and situations like Jeremy, is the importance of a trusted peer or a line manager throughout the process. So injured workers being connected to work is so important, as is, I guess, the importance of understanding what it might be like for an individual or an injured worker that has a mental injury that is off work. They are at home. They've lost some of their support network, being their friends and their colleagues in the workplace. And they've lost a lot of their routine and normality about what work brings for us. So the other thing here is Jeremy's return to work coordinator, whoever that may be in the workplace at your employer. That person for Jeremy was always there for him. The person was always there, always consistent, and always a part of his recovery and his return to work. So again, another connection back to the workplace where he can feel trust, he can feel empathy, and he can feel support. The claim phases through Jeremy here, you can see there's lots of detail on this page, and we will provide these on our website in the coming weeks for you to read again. So don't feel you have to read through all of the detail there, but you will see that there's lots of activity. And usually, most times, a mental injury claim within our scheme, it requires intervention and it requires activity to support these individuals. Where individuals aren't receiving this level of support, they usually find there's some difficulties in their recovery and return to work, and again, their connection back to the workplace. The access to treatment is obviously really important with any mental injury claim. And for Jeremy, that started even before his injury that he lodged his work cover claim for. He'd already connected with his EAP through his workplace. Most places have those, or there is the likes of Beyond Blue and others that could be of support for injured workers. And then obviously there was the identification that he needed ongoing support and likely psychology for his injuries based on his injury and his symptoms. So in summary, for Jeremy's case here, most important is the unwavering support from end to end. Some of these claims and some people's injuries arise from circumstances that we're not always fully across. Jeremy may have been having other difficulties within his life, or this may have been an accumulation of different injuries or circumstances at his workplace. So the one thing that Jeremy had for the whole timeline of his return to work was support from the start to the end. And the two biggest things that I could see there were obviously his return to work coordinator was always moving things forward, was really proactive, and his line manager, his trusted line manager or peer, always super important in any case for an injured worker. And the collaboration. So you'll see along that timeline collaboration between the injured worker, the treater, the worker's family, the employer, different members of the employer were involved, and not to mention, obviously, really important, his case manager as well at the agent was there to support him, provide quick and fast approvals for services along the way also.
Thanks, Chris. A great case study there. How important is the role of the employer in all of this?
Well, yeah, super important again. I think, we've highlighted a couple of things there with Jeremy's case where things had gone to plan, and he obviously had an employer that was empathetic, caring, and supportive. And naturally, the Jeremy's recovery, ran its course as predicted, and his return to work was really well supported also. We have another case study here for Jenny. And unfortunately, in Jenny's case, she was working in the out-of-home care services. And this is a case that we unfortunately do see sometimes. And in Jenny's case, I mean, the first thing you'll see there that, this is an example of the opposite of Jeremy's. Even visually, there's not as much activity here. That you'll see Jenny's name a lot across on these points where Jenny is doing a lot of the driving and pushing for her recovery and support, through a process she's not fully educated on. The lack of, I guess, incident reporting or action on the incident reporting for Jenny was obviously, a key factor in Jenny feeling the way she did. There's certain aspects of that did derail Jenny's recovery and return to work from the start. And for Jenny, she tried to make a return to work. She was keen to work. It's a really good sign for us here at WorkSafe when we do see those attempts where injured workers have tried to return to work. But unfortunately, Jenny going off work again was unfortunate, and it was really a sign of that early intervention piece and early access to treatment that was lacking that may have resulted in her going off work again. There wasn't really a lot of empathy or care shown for Jenny, and it was, we obviously get a partially obstructed view of a injured worker's claim, but for Jenny, we couldn't see that there was a lot of activity, there was a lot of empathy and a lot of care. And talking to Jenny, she certainly didn't feel that. There's also a bit of a litigious approach taken by the employer. Some of the language that was used, throughout Jenny's claim was quite harmful for Jenny, whether that was intended or not from the employer. But there wasn't an acceptance of what Jenny was feeling at the time and of her injury, and that can be quite counterproductive to collaborating with Jenny and also moving her recovery and her return to work in the right direction. There was very little human contact here. Jenny doesn't have a peer. She wasn't able to go and have a cup of tea with a colleague. She wasn't able to talk through her thoughts and her feelings and her requirements around how she might need to be supported by someone from her workplace. A cup of tea and a half an hour discussion can do so much value and so many good things for an injured worker with their work cover claim. I can't understate the importance of that. There was obviously triggers along this timeline. You can see them. There's different parts where intervention could have been, placed to support Jenny by multiple people. So employer, the agent, and even Jenny's GP as well. So there were those missed opportunities, I guess, for Jenny, and support opportunities for Jenny were, it was disappointing to see that some of those hadn't been acted on. Throughout her claim. And obviously there's no rehabilitation, no treatment right until the end. So Jenny's injury has largely remained untreated from start to end on the timeline we've got on the screen there. And that's of real concern. Jenny has self-medicated with alcohol. She has tried to struggle along. She isn't sure of what support networks are there, what she can access. So, again, that collaborative piece and people coming together to talk through a case like Jenny's is so important. And I guess with Jenny, the result is the result. If we want to support people, we want to help them recover and return them to work. Going back to Jeremy's example, there is action, there's collaboration and intervention that's required to support people like Jenny. So for her, fortunately, we were able to support her after that period of time, and things did move along quite quickly after that. And Jenny, made quite a good recovery and did return to work with a different employer. But for her, it really was those delays in support and the lack of collaboration for Jenny that resulted in a poor outcome for most people.
Thanks, Chris. A couple of good examples there at either end of the spectrum. Turning to you now, Joe, I can see that return to work is a real team effort. Could you outline your clinical background and your role as a key part of the recovery and return to work program?
Oh, thanks, Chris. So my professional background is as a psychologist. I work part-time in private practice, and I'm also a member of WorkSafe's clinical panel. The clinical panel is a group of currently practicing medical and allied health professionals, and we provide advice to WorkSafe and the agents to ensure timely return to work outcomes and to maximise health outcomes for our injured workers. We regularly engage with treaters who are treating injured workers in the community, and we aim to collaborate with them and build relationships with these professionals with the goal of maximising recovery outcomes. In terms of the Recovery and Return to Work conferencing program, my role entails, as Chris mentioned, reviewing all of the records and the injured workers file. I then make contact with the treating health professional. For me, generally that's a psychologist, but it could also include a GP or a psychiatrist. And we have a peer discussion about what they're seeing, what advice they might have or what recommendations they might have about how best to support this person. And then I go back and participate in the case conference with the various stakeholders and provide some clinical recommendations to guide the strategy for the injured worker and hopefully get us to the best place for them and for the employer.
Thanks, Joe. So in your experience, what clinically based recommendations should employers be considering when supporting an injured worker following a work-related mental injury?
Absolutely. So firstly, I think it's really useful to think about some of the factors that someone with a mental injury is facing or the context in which they're operating and how these things are likely to impact on the person and from that, their interactions with everyone involved in their claim. So if you have a look at that first slide that's coming up now, in terms of the individual or internal factors that are unique to each person, having a mental health condition is incredibly stressful and overwhelming. We might be dealing with someone who's experiencing this kind of thing for the first time. They might be feeling really scared, really uncertain about their health, about if they'll ever feel normal again. They might feel quite ashamed or embarrassed about their condition, or they might be quite isolated as a result of being away from work, which might be a really big part of their identity. In addition to that, there's external factors, and these are also really significant. The person's likely to be managing multiple appointments. They might be responding to requests from multiple different parties. They might be trying to navigate the health system, or they might be trying to find the treatment that fits for them. So keeping these things in mind, the situation, the context that the person is in at any given time, in terms of recommendations, firstly, consultation. Try and keep the person at the centre of the decision-making that affects them. This can really go a long way to help them feel empowered and supported and give them a sense of autonomy in a situation that can feel very out of control. And this also assists from a treatment perspective in terms of not exacerbating the clinical picture that's already there. Secondly, communication. We've heard from Chris, communication is key. But what can be really helpful is if we really tailor that to the individual's needs and the circumstance at the time. Communication, it might be in different forms at different times across the claim. So, for example, it might start with some email communication and then progress to phone calls and then meetings as the person feels better or starts to recover. We find that we tend to achieve better outcomes if we can find a method or a solution that works best for everyone. And it's really valuable to put the effort into finding the right solution at the right time, because we can actually add more barriers to the landscape if there's no communication at all, or if the communication feels really forced. Unfortunately, we saw in Jenny's case study that 2 months passed there without any communication between Jenny and her employer. And that can really leave someone feeling quite isolated, quite unsupported. And after she was posted a copy of a return to work plan without any consultation or communication, she became quite angry and shut down on the process. Conversely, you could see those 2 points in Jeremy's case study, where he was contacted. There was an agreement about a communication strategy, whether it was the person or the time. And those small details about even things like the best time of day to contact someone, someone with a mental injury who's experiencing significant sleep difficulties, working out the best time of day to contact them can really go a long way to establishing a good relationship and a good foundation for the recovery moving forward. Final recommendation is around flexibility. So we know that there are health benefits of good work, and it's important to recognise that good work is meaningful work. This sometimes can take some thinking outside the box, considering where the person is up to in terms of their recovery. Identifying good work for someone can make them feel valued and supported. It can build their confidence and it can facilitate them recovering at work rather than following that more linear process of waiting for someone to be fully fit before we even start thinking about coming back to work. And that point was highlighted really nicely in the Jeremy case study, where his initial return to work was a trial in a different work area. His manager had thought about his skills and experience and something that maybe his overall professional knowledge would benefit from. And then as his treatment was ongoing, it supported a type of exposure therapy in the workplace. He was gradually increasing his capacity whilst he was increasing his range of duties and work to fulfil his role.
Great, Jo. Can I maybe ask you to give us some examples of where you've used your clinical skills, perhaps as part of the Recovery and Return to Work program, for a successful return to work that employers and our audience may find informative?
Sure. Yeah. Look, two come to mind. I had one instance where an injured worker was continually not responding to an employer's emails offering a return to work plan, and this plan offered some basic kind of admin duties, and this person's role was predominantly a physical role. And this employer, understandably, was getting quite frustrated and interpreting the lack of response as non-compliance and the person being difficult. During my peer discussion with the treating psychologist, I was able to establish that the worker actually had a learning difficulty, and so the administrative duties that were being put forward for them were actually not suitable. But the prospect of discussing that with a return to work coordinator, someone who was unknown to the injured worker, was quite overwhelming. So once we established what was happening in this context, we discussed a plan to manage that with a focus on establishing an agreed means of communication. And that created a space for some consultation about how to identify the best return to work pathway for this person. The second example, and probably something I see a little bit more often, is discussing a treatment plan with a treating psychologist. And in this instance, understanding that part of the treatment plan was a graded exposure program, so gradually progressing through stages that might cause anxiety or distress, and the person using coping strategies or using the things they're learning in treatment to help them move through those stages. So as part of the discussion, we worked out that there were some work-related stages that could form part of the treatment program, and providing that feedback to the employer, they were able to accommodate that. Things like, as Chris mentioned earlier, meeting up with someone for a coffee initially, maybe off-site, and then progressing to coming into the workplace to do that, wearing a uniform versus not wearing a uniform, just having an insight or some understanding about how these things can actually be accommodated by a workplace, but also form part of the treatment plan.
Thanks, Jo. And just following up on that, could I ask you to explain the role of a return to work plan when someone is certified unfit, and how this can help a treating health practitioner understand what the worker can do as part of their return to work?
Sure. So again, keeping in mind the factors and the context that the person is operating in, presenting a return to work plan to someone when they're unfit for work can sometimes feel like pressure. So the timing and how it's presented is really important. Talking about the thinking behind the plan, how it might benefit the person, how it might be meaningful to the workplace, how it might be helpful, how it fits into the big picture of their recovery, can really be helpful. As a treater, it's really helpful to have an understanding of someone's role, the environment that they work in, the environment they might be coming back to, and the options and support that might be made available to help them recover at work. As a treater, that can help me inform treatment planning. We can work on different skills and strategies in treatment to help with aligning with that return to work pathway. As we mentioned earlier, collaboration really is a key component of return to work planning. And so I think it's helpful also when we're doing return to work planning to consider things like case conferencing with the injured person, including them in discussion, their various health professionals, so that we can have a collaborative discussion and tailor a return to work plan that's going to work for everyone.
Right, Jo, some fascinating examples there. Thank you. Chris, coming back to you now, we've heard today those examples of where best practice approach to recovery and return to work has been delivered, but also examples where there was some scope to add some additional support and maybe do a little bit better. Putting aside what is done, can you talk to perhaps the timing of when things happen in this journey?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Look, for mental injury, timing is critical. It's so important. You really do need, from an employer point of view, agent point of view, WorkSafe point of view, we really do need to understand what's happening for that injured worker. Not just what might be on paper, but what could be there, the injured worker's perspective as well on what is happening and what actions might be taking place to make a certain person feel a certain way. So I think the detail around the person's injury, their treatment, and what might be happening at home for them. Do they have the supports there? Are they having difficulties at home? Is also really important to know. So these things, that really does give you the platform to make a judgment, and the judgment call to intervene or not to intervene will be yours to make. And that's something, claim after claim, time after time, most people will hone over time and get better and better at the timing piece of when to support people and maybe when to pull back a bit. The other thing we have that we see a lot is the not the element of presuming something might be happening for an injured worker or an individual. So, an anxiety disorder for one person may be very, very different for another. A diagnosis for one person might be very different from another. So again, getting back to knowing what's happening for that individual and maybe from their perspective is really important and something that should be considered. Inform the worker. I think from the employer's point of view, many workers, putting aside their injury or the circumstances of their injury, the feeling a worker can have to know that they are valued and wanted in a workplace and that they're missed is so powerful. And from a point of view of treatment, it can be so helpful. It can really help someone to set some goals around their own treatment and return to work, to know that the place that they're returning to does want them back and they are a valued employee in person within that environment. So, that's something else, again, that can add to the timing, when to maybe provide that information, or maybe it's not the right time at that point in time. The employer's role is obviously so important in judgment of timing of intervention for all stakeholders in that collaboration. And if the employee is in contact with the injured worker, then throughout the period of their workers' comp claim, the intel and information they are able to provide to other stakeholders, the workers' GP, the claims agent, can be so important and so empowering for anyone that's trying to support an injured worker. To answer your question a little more succinctly, in general, when it comes to timing, earlier the better. When we see an attempt, and it may not be the best attempt that we've seen from an employer, but if that attempt to reach out, show empathy and care for the injured worker, for their employee, if that happens earlier rather than later, we usually see really good results.
Some great advice there, Chris. Thank you. Coming back to you, Lucas, finally, is there an overarching WorkSafe message that you'd like to leave our audience with today?
I think the key one for me is for employers to create some certainty for an injured worker during a period of a lot of uncertainty as well. And that can happen by things like the collaboration that we've spoken about today and the provision of information. So some structure, in terms of how that information is going to be shared. And also the transparency of that information, that focusing on some of the facts. I think we're all human beings also, and that you're putting aside our prejudices. So, I may respond to an event differently to another person, and that's not really my place to judge how that person has or hasn't responded. And when it does happen, that's when we see the process probably go a little bit off track, because the judgment comes into play insofar as the support someone's should be providing. I think we don't by any means want employers to feel like this is all up to them. They have roles and responsibilities, accountabilities under the Work Act as an employer, but we really do encourage employers to tap into the support services at our agent panel. So EML, DXC, Allianz and Gallagher Bassett, and have those upfront conversations about, support services such as mobile case management, clinical panel, the occupational rehab. So especially for employers who can tell from the very beginning that perhaps they may struggle with the support that the worker with a mental injury may require. And one of the key things that we've recently found when we do interview and speak with injured workers is they've also told us that really we could introduce many, many support services, but for them, what will really drive their recovery return to work is the role of the employer. And it's been touched on today about the role that work plays in our lives and being away from work and trying to bridge that gap as well.
Thanks, Lucas, and thanks to all three of you. Some really good insights there. I think it's time that we take some questions now from the chat. Keep those questions coming through if you do have something to ask any of our panelists. We'll kick off with the top question that's getting quite a few likes, and it is, how do you determine if a mental injury or illness is directly due to work or work tasks? What is the criteria for a work-related mental injury? Chris, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, for sure, Chris. There's a process in which the workers' compensation claim and application will be assessed at WorkSafe and at our agents. We call that the eligibility process. So there's a various amount of investigative information that's required, clinical information, and obviously some information around the circumstances of that person's individual incident or the causation of their incident. Also information around the type of work that they do as well can be considered in the investigation period as well. And I think Lucas might have something further to add, having some further agent experience than I. Lucas?
Yeah, I think Chris has touched on it perfectly well. I think the other thing that we want to really reinforce, that work can aggravate someone's pre-existing mental health condition. So what I mean is that, for example, someone may have depression and or anxiety for unrelated reasons. However, due to the circumstances of their job, that has perhaps made it worse and caused them to become a lot more unwell. And that is something that is compensable in Victoria. But I think the preface is that a lot of the investigation occurs early on, and it's about collecting information and also understanding that like Chris has spoken about, the role of work insofar as making that individual unwell. But it is very much a case-by-case scenario. So no one definitive answer, but the agents will kind of coordinate that process as soon as the claim's been received from the employer.
Thanks, Lucas. I might stay with you there because you mentioned there something that the next question touches on. The next question is, how would an employer handle a return to work for an employee that has a mental injury that's not work-related without crossing a line or asking questions that might be too personal?
I think, there's been a lot more change in the community around reducing stigma around mental health. So a lot more people are talking about it. And I think it's probably, I might lean on Joe's clinical experience here around mental health in general, but it would probably be no different, because I think it's about having those open conversations with that person about what supports they need. So something that we often find is when someone isn't perhaps doing something that they should, we seem to go towards, they're not a good employee, or perhaps they're not doing enough, but we haven't really explored why that's happening. And when we tend to go back to the beginning a little bit and ask some questions about, someone's perhaps attendance or their general motivation and perhaps what else could be contributing, we may identify some factors that as an employer they can perhaps support that person with. It's obviously a fine line around someone's privacy as well, and the key thing is to perhaps start the conversation first and foremost. But I might see if Joe's got anything to add.
Sure. Yeah. Look, I think, some of the things we've touched on today are probably the cornerstones of this in terms of consultation and talking to someone about what you're observing and coming from a position of wanting to understand and wanting to support. And also that transparency around, talking about observations, talking about concern, wanting to help and being clear about what the objectives are, rather than coming across as wanting to stick your nose in where it's not wanted or be curious about something that, as the question said, is not work related, but coming from that position of being in a workplace, what are the objectives and how can we work together to support someone to achieve the best outcomes for them and for the workplace.
Perfect. Thanks, Joe. I might stick with you, Joe, if you've got an answer for this one. The next question that's come through is, what is the best approach when an injured worker is fit for duties, but due to sexual harassment or bullying in the workplace, they feel too let down to return to that organisation?
Mm-hmm. Really, really tricky circumstance. A service that has been a relatively new service and can be quite helpful in the scheme at the moment is a facilitated discussion. So it's a service that's like a mediation, but is facilitated by an independent person. It's a staged process, so it's not immediately putting injured workers in a room with the people that they might have some concerns or difficulties about. But where it can be helpful is to kind of work through what some of the concerns are, to feel heard, to have the concerns out on the table and really come to an understanding of whether these difficulties can be worked around or can be resolved. Sometimes there's internal processes at an employer going on that work alongside the WorkSafe process. But I think, the best process is to try and consult and to take an overall perspective of the situation and think about what's going to be the best outcome for everyone. And in some circumstances, it might be that it's not returning with particular people or to a particular environment. But if we can try and understand what that looks like rather than jump straight to that outcome, sometimes I think that can be quite powerful for the injured person as well, to have felt heard and felt understood and included as part of the solution.
And Chris, in a similar way, if agreement can't be reached and an employer is trying everything they can to get an employee back, but the employee doesn't feel comfortable or isn't willing to come back, what are the next steps there, and how can employees get that resolution?
Yeah, it's a situation we often see ourselves in, looking at these claims and referring back to our recovery and return to work case conferences. It's often at that point sometimes that we see a claim and there's been multiple attempts and things haven't quite worked out for either employer or for the injured worker. So at that point, we would generally refer to an occupational rehab provider, and there's multiple services there that can support the injured worker to find alternate work. Usually start the process with what's called a transferable skills analysis. This is where a skilled rehab counsellor will talk through with the injured worker their desires, their wishes, their qualifications, their interest in employment into the future, whether they've changed or whether that might be something new. And then there's a couple of other services that can follow. Job-seeking services and also new employment services can sort of top and tail to support the injured worker into what will be new employment for them.
Thanks, Chris. We've had a couple of questions come through in relation to some stigma around mental health especially, and concerns around people potentially milking the system, and that stigma, how that might affect employees in their return to work. Lucas, is this something that WorkSafe sees quite a lot, and how is this shaking out with mental injury, as we know that there still is a lot of stigma around, even though it is starting to lift a little bit?
I think, like I mentioned earlier, we've seen that the community respond a bit more differently or a bit more positively to individuals talking about their mental health. I think with that, though, the stigma does still continue to flow through. And I think we can particularly see it when we are reviewing some interaction notes between our agent panel and perhaps employers, and just general back and forth. And I think it again goes back to the prejudices around someone's response to a particular event or something that's happened at work. And I think that person's responded because it's that person's response. And it's not, I think the position of a return to work coordinator employer is to really try and focus on the facts surrounding that event. So, for example, a particular injured worker who may have responded to a discussion about performance or perhaps some work duties, and the employers, may react to saying, well, that's just because they're wanting to be off work, they're not really injured, etc. So that we start to see that emotional response creeping into it. But I think, again, I might lean on Joe, who's got that clinical background, to provide some further information.
Thanks, Lucas. I think this is, it's really reflective of, as you said, the broader community and differing attitudes around mental health. I think in this context, probably again, what's really important is consultation and talking to people about what they're comfortable with being discussed in a workplace. You'll have people who are very comfortable talking about the difficulties they're facing and talking to their peers and colleagues, and at the other end of the spectrum, people who are very private and don't want any of that discussed. And that's where that kind of consultation and flexibility comes into it, about working together around how do we support people, what's going to make people feel comfortable in their recovery and return to work, rather than exacerbating the clinical picture by discussing these things or not discussing them, depending on what's going to be best for that person.
Thank you, Joe. A question's just come through, Lucas, asking, does WorkSafe run any training programs for return to work for mental injury specifically?
So we haven't, but it is currently something that we are putting together as part of the 2-day return to work coordinator program for all employers. So a big focus on concepts around return to work for mental injury claims. But I think for what employers can access now is perhaps the WorkWell toolkit on our website. So that's been developed over a number of years, and some funding has been allocated to different employers around concepts that they have tested and, I guess, rolled out that have supported return to work in the mental injury space, mental injury in general. But I think as part of the 2-day return to work coordinator program that is currently available, the next iteration will have a lot more of a focus on mental injury, but also secondary mental injury, which we see as a sequelae of physical injury claims, where someone has been off work for an extended period of time, for example, following a back injury, and as a result has developed a mental injury due to the limitations on their function and activity and so on. But in summary, it's coming through the next iteration of our 2-day return to work coordinator workshop that our agents and other third-party providers can also deliver.
Excellent. Good to know. Thank you, Lucas. We are just about out of time. So if you have any questions that haven't been answered in today's session, please make sure you contact WorkSafe's advisory service for assistance. And I would like to thank our fabulous expert WorkSafe speakers today for joining us. Lucas Kowalski, Manager, Return to Work. Thank you, Lucas.
Thanks, Chris.
Chris Lyons, Recovery Claims Specialist. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
And Joe Els, the Clinical Panel Psychologist for WorkSafe's Clinical Panel. Thank you, Joe.
Most welcome.
And we hope you have found this a very interesting and informative session. This webinar will be available online via WorkSafe's website next month. And we'll note on the screen shortly a list of the contacts that have been mentioned that you might find helpful. If you have any requests for further information, we recommend you get in touch. And remember, if there is something you want to discuss urgently when you're back at work, there is the WorkSafe advisory line and emergency lines available for you. And you are going to get a survey link if you have time to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. We would very much appreciate it. Thank you very much for joining us today.